3 years ago, we rethought this very event to focus around an annual meeting address, which 2 years ago was named for the amazing Harry Cobb. He was one of the most important humanitarians in the architectural world, and he is sorely missed. This is a commissioned lecture by a leading figure in the architectural practice, education, or theory, who brings a distinctive point of view to the question of what can and should animate architectural discourse and production now. Someone who continues the moral and intellectual project that Harry pursued. Dean Milton Curry of USC, Dean Sarah Whiting of the GSD, and Dean Renee Chang of the University of Washington delivered the first 3 lectures. And tonight I'm very pleased to welcome Meejin Yoon, the Dean of the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell University, for this year's Harry N. Cobb annual meeting address. In addition to her leadership role in education, now at Cornell and previously as the head of architecture at MIT, Meejin, along with her partner Eric Howler, are, simply put, one of the most inventive and influential architects of our generation. Although I could go on at length describing the importance of her work and her impact on the discipline, I'll instead point you to Howler and Yoon's just published book entitled Verify and Field. It's a substantive evidence of their exploration of the complex relationship between matter and meaning. So it's my honor to welcome architect and educator Meejin Yoon.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here this evening in person, to be introduced by Paul, following Mario, and also Rosalie. So thank you for the invitation. I have to do a few steps, I was told, so let's see. Great. The Architecture League was transformative in my career and my life, so it's particularly special, I think, for me to be here today. And I think I wouldn't be here today without the Architecture League. Everything okay? Okay, great. Okay, so what's the matter? Is a way of taking stock of the moment. In doing so, it asks not only what's the matter, but what matters, and how do we as architects build, create, or enable what matters. If we survey the present, we find ourselves in an awkward moment where everything we've been taught about social distancing and the pandemic is shifting. We're in person, yet also hybrid and remote, and we're finding that we have to relearn what it means to be social. Pre-pandemic, we had already experienced a saturation of technologies in the public realm. Every interaction, every encounter was and is mediated. And we live in a planetary and interconnected age, a moment characterized by both the superabundance of information and connectivity, and at the same time, an unprecedented amount of uncertainty. If this moment were not so fraught, we might even say it's ironic that the age of information coincides with the age of post-truth, alternative facts, and alternative realities. Today, we feel politically more and more divided, and we have collectively witnessed the fragility of our institutions, as we heard before, and the fragility of democracy, alongside the resiliency of violence and hate. We have also seen the erosion of women's rights nationally and human rights internationally. We see violence and destruction and tragedy both in the Ukraine and many, many parts of the world. And at the same time, we're grappling with the legacies of violence, forced dispossession, enslavement, and racism in the United States. In addition to these deep social, economic, and political questions of our time, we're amidst a climate catastrophe. The planet is burning, quite literally. So what can we do in the face of these daunting, layered challenges as designers and stewards of the built environment? Where do we have agency? How do we take action to build a better world? When the Eameses were asked to define design, Charles Eames responded that design is an expression of purpose. When asked if design was a method of expression, he responded, no, it's actually a method of action. And when asked what the boundaries of design were, he responded rhetorically, what are the boundaries of problems? So purpose, action, and problems, and we have a lot of problems, and these problems are multi-layered and complex, and I can't do it in a Boston accent, but wicked hard. So how can we imagine or reimagine architectural education to prepare the next generation for our present and future world? And I wanted to use this lens of purpose, action, and problems, and our kind of inherited institutional pedagogical models to think through this. The Architecture League is an incredible institution because it straddles somehow very nimbly the academy and practice. And I thought tonight I'd highlight 3 other academic institutional contexts, MIT, Cornell, UVA, in thinking about the relationship between pedagogy and practice today. I'm going to try to use the trope of the model, both literal models and figurative models, to look at the feedback loops between pedagogy and practice and speculate on the agency of architecture today and in the future. So Mark Wigley, in his essay on disciplining of architecture, shares how the first universities were not institutions or places the way we've come to know them today, but really a collection of faculty and practices we would now refer to as pedagogies, like the literal mode of the practice of teaching. And MIT was the first official school of architecture in the US, literally beginning as a collection of books and artifacts and of pedagogical practices we know today as the studio and thesis. And in the curation of this collection, there was the knowledge and practices to be included, what we would now call the canon, and the knowledges and practices to be excluded, which the academy is grappling with today. At MIT, in the wake of the Second World War, it moved to consolidate its position as a leader in scientific and technological education, building on both its military research and industry partnerships. Almost in tandem, questions of computing, visual communication, human interaction found their way into the Department of Architecture, creating an early culture of collaboration between art, science, and technology. The artist György Kepes was hired by the Department of Architecture to create and teach a radically new set of drawing courses influenced by scientific imagination. So this long-standing relationship at MIT between the visual arts, computing, and building technology was my own context as a young faculty member learning how to teach and practice. And it is a mode that oscillates between, I think, building discourse and testing to failure. The first literal design model I wanted to share is the Collier Memorial, which one could say, and I want to kind of present it to you today as really a one-to-one research model. The project was born out of tragedy, out of the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, where Officer Sean Collier was killed on campus. It was a very tense time in the city. The city was really on edge, and there was a kind of fine line, or a foggy fine line, if you can possibly imagine that, between the sense of patriotism and a sense of a kind of rise of nationalism. And it was in this context that I had to first learn how to bring forward a design project and process that could navigate this kind of tense moment between patriotism and nationalism. The project is simply a 5-pointed figure with a kind of void carved out of it. But the one mandate and request from the family and the university was that the memorial represent a kind of MIT-ness that Sean Collier loved. And so the project actually comes out of the kind of pedagogical history of the thesis as a mode of research, where students, develop their own thesis projects. And it relies, like this project could not have been conceived of without the thesis work of Philippe Bloch and Michael DeYoung under the advisorship of Professor John Oxendorf. But it was also the first time where it became clear to me that engineering was not a science with a single answer. And we worked with John Oxendorf and his team of engineers, ODB, along with Nippers Helbig, and there was a moment when there were 5 engineers around a table disagreeing on what I think should be like true false. Would the memorial stand or not? And the reason this was under debate is because of the flatness of this 5-way series of arches and the shallow dome that was part of the design. And part of that was, this techno-affirmativism that, is hard to avoid at MIT. And we thought, well, we have CNC and we have technologies and we can create the level of precision in order to create a perfect fit for this memorial, to create this shallow vaulted structure and stand on its own with each block supporting the next block and no steel reinforcement. And that was important to the concept that literally each block would support the next block. And it's not a visual exercise, it's a physical exercise. But because the engineers could not agree on whether it could stand in full compression with no tension, we developed the memorial as a 1-to-1 scale test of the principles. And thus, we have these strain gauges between each of the joints within the memorial. Students were crawling all over the memorial in order to place these gauges. And what we were doing was measuring if, as the load went into the memorial, because we would release the scaffold, as that load began to transfer from the center to the legs, was there any movement laterally that could create a catastrophic failure vertically. And so the memorial scaffold was built on these giant scales that were measuring. The masons were like rotating the scaffold to disengage it from the memorial very, very carefully and slowly over many, many hours so that the load path would go into the legs. And there was someone on a computer measuring all of this, and it was the most stressful, I think, 6 hours of nothing happening, except till the very end, when at 95% of the load transfer, there was a movement between 2 blocks. And at that point, we put in the grout, and then the tension took some action. So one of the engineers was 95% correct. I think you get an A for that still. But, it was an important lesson for us, I think, in the discipline and collaborating with engineers. And the other incredible thing is we had the fortunate ability to work on it with students, both undergraduate students, master's students, and doctoral students at MIT. And I think this is one of the really special parts of our discipline, something I really treasure and hope we never lose, which is the ability to literally learn by doing. So traditionally, the model is a means to an end. And we saw this kind of literally in the Collier Memorial. The memorial continues to yield information after its construction, in terms of its structural information. And I think this kind of hands-on nature is particularly special to our discipline. The statistician George Box famously quipped, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So I'd like to continue on our journey of pedagogical models to get us to Cornell via UT Austin. UT Austin became a focal point for the convergence where innovations in architecture pedagogy were cohering around a set of principles that recast architectural education in North America. This is the group Colin Rowe, John Haydick, Bob Slutsky, and others that would become known as the Texas Rangers. Their famous 9-square grid problem became a framework for teaching design studios that aligned with a kind of emerging formalism where plasticity of form was decoupled from structural necessities, an exercise that was alive and well when I was a student. The Texas Rangers formed a kind of network of pedagogical influence. They would extend to Cooper Union, Cornell, Syracuse. John Haydick became the dean of the Cooper Union. Colin Rowe had a huge influence at Cornell. And the emphasis on formalism, abstraction, procedure, and representation, and here kind of embraced by the term cardboard architecture, was a mode of working that was intentionally disengaged from the material tectonic or constructional basis of architecture. And here we see an aerial photograph of House 2 in built form, almost like an abstract model. So if we fast forward to today and the context that generated the 9-square grid problem, I think it would be highly challenged and almost impossible to resurrect. Today, there is no architecture without social, political, material, and environmental consequences. 2 recent books map out, I think, the contemporary theory around and thinking around climate in our discipline. Daniel Barber's focus on climate and operational energy, and Keel Mo's with a focus on embodied energy. And today, I think we need to think about both in every single design decision we make. Keel Mo argues a building represents an object instance, a temporary configuration of materials within a much larger flow of materials and labor. Mo's analysis of the Seagram's building is a kind of material audit, highlighting the urgent need to account for the brute materiality, what it takes to produce, refine, ship, install, demolish, and dispose of architecture, both in terms of construction ecologies and carbon footprint. So whether we're building in local masonry units, working with building trades to maximize the speed of construction, or working in solid mass timber, the materials we build with their extraction and impact, from carbon footprint to carbon sequestering to carbon form, from adaptive reuse to circular construction, questions of labor. I think these are the questions and struggles we are all grappling with today in the practice and in the academy. So, as we focus on energy and environment, I would say over the last 10, 15 years, our models shifted from SIMULACRA, the cardboard models or the rendering, to simulation. The simulation tools helped us look specifically at climate and context. And in our own practice, we have used some of these simulation tools. This is a project in which the design brief mandated a kind of transparency, full height glass, and this kind of visual transparency in creating this community amenity structure. Yet creating a fully glazed structure in this climate context seemed very problematic. We looked both at the regional conditions and the hyperlocal conditions, and ultimately we created this kind of supersized public canopy kind of inspired by the Hydrographic Studies Center by FISAC. And for us, the simulation tools aided us in a kind of search for a geometry to the louvers that could maximize diffuse light, minimize direct light and heat gain, and try to use the most minimal amount of material possible as its kind of underlying principles. So ultimately, that shape was found, the one in the lower, well, it's the next slide, but the lower right-hand corner. We created a series of custom extruded louvers in a way that would create maximum shade and kind of self-shade the architecture to create a kind of bright, ventilated, and shaded public space. And while every part of this kind of coincidentally 9-square grid canopy is oriented to maximize shade and minimize heat, the question of how to build with what, as it's still made of glass, steel, and aluminum, continues to be a challenge on every project at scale. So I think research and scholarship in the academy will be pushing practice to reconsider what architecture is in terms of matter and the environmental consequences of every decision as it affects energy, material, and labor. And I think the kind of the faith we put in simulation will also begin to shift. I think technology itself is being recast at the moment. We're learning about all of the bias in our technology. And so I think we're at a fraught moment in every single sector of our discipline. This is another project that deals with technology. So here, computation and data are enabling us to see great inequities in our built environment. With colleagues Alex Cobb and Joe Fernando in the Design Across Scales Lab at Cornell. I'm working with them to look at New York City LiDAR data, which is this data set of three-dimensional scans of New York City that exist at super high resolution, essentially creating a kind of point cloud model of the city. And we're using this in a project called Treefolio, Equitable and Effective Urban Shade, which looks at different neighborhoods to analyze the high-resolution data, looking at the street tree as a kind of urban infrastructure that mitigates heat and creates shade, and how equitable distribution of this resource can exist in the city. We're working collaboratively with colleagues at Cornell Tech, developing a kind of shade simulation data set with this open source data to understand and communicate the street tree as a shared urban resource to help kind of engender greater urban equity to mitigate climate change. Lastly, I wanted to talk about institutions and their incompleteness. I think this project has been shared many times, but I wanted to share it on behalf of the collective design team with you this evening. So University of Virginia, and especially in this moment where we're thinking about our democracy, so the University of Virginia is associated with those American ideals of both democracy and higher education because of its founder, Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, third president of the U.S., the architect of the University of Virginia, and owner of over 600 enslaved men, women, and children in his lifetime. This historical marker that Mabel Wilson often refers to tells the history of UVA with no mention of slavery. And so the first recognition of this undertold history was in this form of an expression of regret issued by the university's Board of Visitors in 2007. And this plaque, which was installed near the rotunda, had this unintended consequence of sparking outrage among the students at the University of Virginia. They were outraged by the limits of the recognition, small, underfoot, again, highlighting Thomas Jefferson. And so that same year, Professor Frank Dukes began UCARE, the University Community Action for Racial Equity. And one of his student interns created the student advocacy group called Memorial to Enslaved Laborers in 2009, so 10 years before the memorial, which bears its name, would be built because of a student and a student's research project and then internship. So in 2012, this history became even more tangible when archaeologists discovered 70 unmarked graves behind the university's official cemetery. And that's when the president created the Commission on Slavery at the university. So when our design team, which includes Mabel Wilson, Eto Ototigbe, Eric Haller, Frank Dukes, and Greg Bleem, and many others, began this work to engage and develop the memorial for enslaved laborers, a decade of work had already gone into the project. And so, for us, what was really important was we thought to hold the design process at bay, do a listening tour, hear from the community and the descendant community in particular, and listen before we could kind of test ideas. But it was actually through the visualization and the testing of ideas that I think really sparked conversations that go way beyond design and architecture. And I think the Morrison quote that you read was particularly, moving to me, Mario, because we did feel like we should not do anything. We felt like fearful and worried about moving forward, but we were able to move forward because we're a group. I think the collaboration and the variety of expertise, from a historian to a community engager to landscape, as a group we were able to move forward with the community. And what we learned was the memorial shouldn't be a monument, but should just be a space in and of itself, a space for the community to gather, to learn from the past, and to advance the commemorative landscape for racial justice today, to tie the kind of history to the present. The memorial had to kind of negotiate its landscape, be both kind of inviting and open in scale, but somehow also lose the university when you're within it. And so it's nestled into the landscape. And what was very special about the memorial was we had this opportunity to work with a group of really committed historians working on the archive, looking through the work ledgers, the personal letters of slave owners, which must have been so painful to read, and uncover the daily life and labor and violence of the time. So historians estimate that there were approximately 4,000 enslaved laborers. For the majority, the names are today unknown. We know just the first names of about 500 community members, and only for a handful of people do we know a first and a last name. But we felt it was important to share both what was known and what was unknown, and that resulted in this genealogical cloud of the community that stretches across the inner surface. There's 4,000 memory marks, which are kind of placeholder lines. And there are a few hundred names and kinship and occupation. And the marks kind of dig into the stone with the gesture of an arc, which allows that cut to hold the water a little bit longer after it rains than the flat surface around it, making the stone appear to cry, weep, or bleed after a rainstorm. And I think one of the most important things the project the university did was hire a genealogist, not hire an architect, but hire a genealogist, Dr. Shelley Murphy, who traced the descendants of the enslaved, whose names had been discovered in the historical records. Pictured here, we have two of them, Detisa Gathers and Colleen Yates, who were local activists and leaders of the descendant community and formed the committee of descendants who we engage with on a regular basis. And we knew the memorial would be ongoing and incomplete, and 5 names were discovered after the memorial was completed and hand-carved above one of these memory marks. Davy Hearn, Fanny Gillette Hearn, Bonnie Castle Hearn, Lily Hearn, and Ben Snowden were carved in place. So the memorial dedication didn't happen because of the pandemic, but as soon as the construction fence was removed, the broader UVA and Charlottesville community filled the space in remembrance of George Floyd. The community took a knee for approximately 9 minutes as a reminder of the violence and injustices that persist in the wake of slavery. So the memorial opened to the public just as the Confederate monuments in Richmond began to come down. They were actually taken down by the same builder who built the memorial, which I think is something to note. And what's important to be aware of is during this multi-year period where we were working on the memorial, the city of Charlottesville had already begun debating the legacy of Confederate monuments, which is what made Charlottesville and UVA a flashpoint for the white nationalist rally in 2018. The unresolved legacy of Thomas Jefferson and the university was precisely the kind of opening the white nationalists seized upon. And I wanted to share this map of Confederate monuments. Here we see the trend of constructing Confederate war monuments not immediately following the Civil War, but during the Jim Crow era and again during the Civil Rights era, not to celebrate Confederate heroes, but rather to further a Confederate white nationalist narrative in the public realm. So as our incomplete institutions evolve, we need to continue to learn from our histories, actively expanding our histories, and to do this through collectives and collaborations. And in charting the future of our discipline, I think it's hard to do that without more deeply understanding our past. If we want to make the world better, we need to understand the world better. So if we take this opportunity to kind of speculate on the future of the discipline and the future of architectural education, I think we have some hints as to the answers among the next generation. And these are just some images that you see all around campuses, I think, of architecture schools, and these are from Cornell. And so I think in order to peer into that future, sometimes that future is actually locked away in our studios and labs, classrooms on our campuses. It's this collection of faculty and students and our kind of collective practices that not only have insights into the future, but I think play an important role and responsibility for testing that future. And these are just a few Cornell examples to conclude. To advance equity and justice through engaged scholarship, working with memory workers and communities. To produce actionable knowledge, to advance sustainability and resiliency, which sometimes means unbuilding, in order to rethink how we build anew and how we scale that knowledge to communities and cities while empowering imagination and transforming imagination into action. I think this is what we're thinking about in practices, in our practice, I'm sure in all of your practices, and in the academy. And I think what matters and how we build what matters, I can summarize probably in 3 sentences, and you didn't need to hear that 30-minute lecture. But if I were to recap, I would say, as we move forward into the future, I think we need to continue to learn by doing. That is something very special and important in our discipline. We need to move forward with a heightened consciousness and expertise at the intersection of environmental justice and social justice. And we need to move forward together through collaborations and collectives. And so I'm going to close this talk on the roof of Rand Hall at Cornell in 1952, where Buckminster Fuller and his architecture students, including Art Gensler here, designed and constructed Fuller's geoscope, a 21-foot geodesic dome. And in 1969, Buckminster Fuller proposed a great logistics game as an interactive anticipatory design tool that played out how to overcome energy scarcity and territorial politics. And he has this very, very powerful quote: "To make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone." Thank you.